All right. How are you guys doing? Welcome to the Love Thy Neighbor Podcast Network. I'm your host, Anthony Wilson. And today we are going to dive into a great discussion with a doctor in Jewish and studies and biblical studies, and a scholar that has written books and teaches and lives out what he's learned. And so we will dive into our discussion. But before we get in, I definitely want to thank all of you that support the Love Thy Neighbor Podcast Network. Your gifts and your prayers have allowed us to continue to do this podcast. 2021 was an amazing year, and we expect to do much greater things in 2022. If you're listening to this by way of podcast, please make sure that you subscribe so that you get all of the podcast posts. If you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure you hit that like button and the subscribe button so that you can get every episode that we put out. And so I want to thank you again for tuning in. We are going to dive into a powerful discussion about the Second Temple period. Some people call it the intertestamental period or Second Temple Judaism. But we're going to hear from an expert, Dr. Juan Marcos, and we're going to welcome him to the show. We've been trying to connect for a while. We finally have, and I'm excited about that. How are you, Dr. Juan?
I'm doing well, and I'm very happy and privileged to be part of your show. When I first got your initial message, I was excited because this is a topic that is a very passionate area of study for me. I spent a tremendous amount of time on it as part of my academic work as well as religious studies. And anytime anybody raises that topic, I'm there to talk about it because I think it's extremely important for, as we mentioned before, for different religious traditions, not just Judaism, of course.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, Dr. Juan, what could you tell us just a little bit about you? You already mentioned that you're a scholar, but what else do you want people to know about you?
Well, I'm very happily married, and I have three boys, 9, 7, and 2. And I'm an engineer by day, but I'm the rabbi of two small. We call them chavarot. They're like basically home synagogues. So we meet in two different homes, and that's a big passion for me. I love the synagogue liturgy and the people call worship and just everything being involved with that. Of course, it's in Hebrew. It's something that's ancient. But I have my full-time job. But the other passion for me is writing, because in many ways it's just I get to put all those things that I learned into a form that people can access, whether it's in audiobooks or Kindle or whatever it is. And I think that you get to impact people that you never meet,
Yeah.
and then occasionally you'll hear back, you'll get a message, and you'll get a text or something, and like, oh, I just read your book, and sometimes they'll ask questions, and sometimes they'll say, well, I don't agree with this, but can you help me understand? It's just very fulfilling, and it's just a passion that if you have it, you understand what I mean, and just sharing that information that I was privileged to learn is very exciting for me.
Yeah, that's amazing, and and I thank you for your work, because we need people taking what they've learned and sharing it, and kind of putting it into this huge pot of information that's out there. And when someone studies something meticulously, um, it gives a great opportunity for those of us that are interested in certain topics to learn from someone who's put in the time and effort. You mentioned something, sometimes people disagree. How do you deal with that, as a person that like, this is what I've studied, I've put in years of study, and someone just says, well, I disagree with that. How do you, how do you deal with that, knowing all that you put into your studies? It's not like you just woke up and just came up with a theory. You actually put in a lot of time and effort to study it.
Yes. Well, I think that one of the things that helped me is I was very fortunate to find programs that were, I think, geared toward people that were professionals in other areas. So that they knew that you had like your full-time position, but I would go to these places as we talked about. But they were very intense academically. So the schools that I went to, they were Jewish schools, but they were also academic. And so you had to defend your thesis, right? Your idea, your proposition. And I remember when I was going through my dissertation, it took me 3 years. I was doing it part time, and I would get back these hundreds of pages that were edited and marked up, and professors and rabbis were critiquing, and you didn't prove this, and I mean there were so many. It was a very humbling experience. Let's put it that way. And it wasn't an issue of you had to agree with them. It's just you had to prove and you had to show why you had come up with this determination or this view. And I tell people all the time, it's a very good process. I mean, you have to humbling is, I have to go back to that word. I mean, it's just a process that you have to learn. And so I don't have a problem when people disagree. What I try to tell people is I'm going to lay out the facts that I know. And then there are different possibilities to interpret them, of course, right? This is how we have different religious traditions, but we have to sort of look at what we can both agree on. And then we sort of propose our views, and then we get the evidence and say, well, this is what I have to support this view. And as long as there can be that respect and an approach that recognizes that, okay, we have archaeology, we have text, we have history. I think you can have a meaningful dialogue. It's about the exchange, and maybe I didn't consider a perspective. Scholars often disagree with each other, and it's part of that process of investigating and learning more.
Yeah, that is amazing, because what I've learned in my limited experience is that it all depends on someone's approach, right? Different scholars take different, interpretive approaches. Someone may come from a philosophical point of view, some come from a theological point of view, some come from a historical point of view. And when they're coming together and they're having discussions, they are bringing nuances to each other that may be valuable, if you're willing to, like you said, sit down and kind of listen, like, okay, I never considered that. Let me put that into the calculator and see what comes out, with that. So I think that's a great process in any discipline. I think so. I think that would help even, just in common communication, just being able to talk to people who think differently. And I think, as you being a rabbi, living in the United States, you probably come across a lot of people who think differently,
Yes.
than you do. And so what you said about being humble, I am 100% in agreement with. Humility might be the untapped superpower. Humble people can get a lot farther in a conversation than prideful people.
Well, I could mention one thing. Our family is called Sephardic Jews. We have a background of Spain and Portugal, in the Mediterranean, like Morocco and so forth. And in the medieval period, there were, of course, Christians, there were Jews, but there were also Muslims and in the peninsula. And this interchange, it could be problematic sometimes. I mean, obviously there was violence, but there was also an exchange of ideas. And one thing that Islam brought was a rediscovery of ancient Greek texts and histories and things like that. And they sort of put that on the table, and Christian and Jewish scholars they would translate these documents into their respective languages, and at least intellectually there could be some kind of interaction.
Right.
And I think, talk about America, it's the same thing. Like, we live in a pluralistic society, and I think that the Jews, when we first came to the United States, they were happy. I mean, they were privileged to be here, and they recognized that in Christianity there was a love for the biblical texts, and I think they sort of they found some common ground with that. And I think that when you can find that common ground, you have to have respect, you have to have humility, and that can really open up these kinds of exchanges, right? You can dialogue, you can learn something, and it doesn't mean that a person has to be completely in sync, but as long as you can have that open conversation, I think it resolves so much anger and hatred that we see throughout different parts of the world, where there's no there's no tolerance, just for a basic discussion. So
yes, I agree. I agree. Thank you for that. Um, so um, let's get a little bit deeper into our discussion. Could you do kind of a brief overview of what we mean by Second Temple Judaism or the Second Temple period? I mean, what, for the lay person that may be just now being introduced to that, what could you give us kind of a brief overview of what that is?
yes, yes. So I think most of your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with King David,
Mm-hmm.
or Saul. So what we have in ancient Israel is we have these independent tribes. They're tied to each other by an ancient history. They're genetically connected to each other. They have a family history. But in many ways, they're sort of like independent states. They don't necessarily get along all the time. You see that in the biblical text. But they have these external threats: the Philistines and the Moabites, the Ammonites, all these different groups that are there. And so Saul comes on the scene, and he becomes the first king of what we call the United Monarchy. So there's the 12 tribes come together to some extent, because there's always some resistance. And they say, okay, we'll back this individual really as a chieftain. His purpose is to make war against these people, to defend the people of Israel. And as we see even in the book of Samuel, sometimes his power is limited. And even Israelites aren't necessarily on board with his power, because the king is going to have to tax. He's going to have to take people into the army, things of that nature. So there's always that issue of power and the lay people and what they have to give up. But he becomes the first king of Israel. And then, of course, we know the story of David, where in some sense he's an usurper, but of course, from the biblical standpoint, he's been anointed by we would say Hashem, by God, to become the next king. And under David, the kingdom of Israel reaches some measure of stability. And under Solomon, his son, it really reaches its greatest extent. There's a measure of peace. Solomon is an international, you could say, strategist. He has marriages with a lot of different women from different kingdoms, and part of the reason is that secures stability, because he has bride from Egypt, all the major powers. And at the time when you had a wife from these different powers, there's a measure of peace. You can often see that in ancient Rome, or any other history. When you have two groups of people that fight each other, they exchange hostages, or they have a marriage relationship, and so that brings a measure of stability. So the Israelite kingdom reaches its extent of farthest extent under Solomon, but under his son Rehoboam, there is a division that takes place. And that division causes there to be essentially a civil war to some extent, with the northern tribes becoming the kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom, of course, is the kingdom of Judah. But it's not just comprised of Judah. Many people make that mistake. There's the tribe of Benjamin. The tribe of Simeon is actually located in the boundaries of Judah. So you actually have three tribes, and then you have some Levites and what we call the Kohanim, the priests, that are still there, because the temple is in Jerusalem. And this issue is something that sometimes people don't understand. The North is concerned because they still have one history with their southern brothers, if you will, because the temple is in Jerusalem, right? That's the focal point of Israelite worship at the time. And so you still have people going to Jerusalem, and of course bringing their korbanot, their sacrifices, their taxes, if you will, their temple tax. And so the North goes sort of in a different direction, because they want to set up their own cultic centers. They want to have their own places of worship, because they don't want there to be, at the time, there's not a difference between politics and religion.
Right.
It's so eventually these two powers are separate, and to the east of them there are powers that are growing. There's the Assyrian Empire, and of course we know this from history, independent of the Bible. But the Bible also tells us that the Assyrian Empire begins to stretch out towards the west. And one of the things that they do is that eventually they will make the northern kingdom a vassal kingdom. So the vassal kingdom has to pay taxes, they have to pay fealty, they might have to fight on behalf of the Assyrians. Eventually that doesn't work out. The Assyrians begin to transfer population from the northern kingdom to different parts of their empire. And their thinking is that if we displace people to one place and then we replace them with another group of people, those people won't rebel because they're not in their normal environment, right? They're cut different language, different place. So they have like this unique policy. And then eventually they end the northern kingdom of Israel as an independent political entity. The southern kingdom, and this happens in 722 BCE or BC, well, the southern kingdom continues to exist for quite some time. It's not until 586 where a different power, the Babylonians, come to the fray. And what they do is initially the kingdom of Judah is also a vassal kingdom. But if you're a king and you're subordinate to another king, that's not a good position. Because of course, they're going to expect things to do. You have to do things for them, and you see this throughout history. So eventually, they try to rebel, and they fail. And this is sort of the time of Jeremiah the prophet, and so forth. So the Babylonians take vengeance against the king that is rebelling against them, and they destroy Jerusalem and they destroy the temple. And what they transplant the upper echelons of society. And the reason that they do the upper echelons is because those are the leaders, right? Those are the priests and the Levites. Those are the educated, the rich people, if you will, the landowners. These are the ones that can raise the lower people to fight. So if you sort of cut off the head, the most people are not going to raise up in arms against a mighty empire. This is where people like Daniel, comes into play, things of that nature, and some, prophets like Ezekiel. So what we have this Babylonian captivity that people know from the biblical text. But when the Persians come onto the scene and they take over the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persians, they have a different way of thinking. They approach empire with the idea of, if we allow people to go back to their original places of where they dwelt, where they lived, that will be, we're being gracious, if you will, and that will, and they'll have loyalty to us. And what we're going to do is we're going to strengthen those local connections so that they maintain their religious and to some extent their political unity, but under as a province of the Persian Empire. So what happened 515 BCE is Cyrus the Great, and it's amazing because you can actually still see his tomb. It's just incredible when you see these things. You see pictures of them or you see them in person. He takes a policy that's very conciliatory, and he says, all these people that the Babylonians and other people have transplanted, we're going to allow them to go back to their original places. And he does this for the people of Israel, to the Judean or the Judahite exiles, whatever term you want to use. And not only that, but he says you're going to get to rebuild the temple. And eventually, under Darius, one of the successor kings, they will have imperial authority to set up the religion and the laws of that area as per their convictions, Israelite convictions. So this is where you have Ezra and Nehemiah. They're of course very famous. They're really from a second generation, because the first exiles go back with Zerubbabel, or as some people say, Zerubbabel. More in English. So he's appointed as the first governor, but it's successive generations under Ezra and Nehemiah that go back and they rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and they really reinvigorate this rebuilding process. So when we talk about the Second Temple period, scholars generally say it starts about 515, when that edict comes in, and then from that point on until the destruction of the temple, the Second Temple in Jerusalem, in 70 CE. Now, some scholars would actually argue that we should extend that, because as long as there's sort of an active hope for the reconstruction of the temple, you could sort of, in many ways, sort of push that boundary out. There's a great Jewish-Roman war that takes place from 66 in the first century till 73. You may have heard of Masada. Masada in the land of Israel is like the last stronghold that falls. The temple is destroyed, but there are still Jews in the land, and for the next essentially 60 years, Jews are going to be trying to reestablish the temple and reestablish Judean independence, and they do so for short periods of time later on. But so we're really talking about 515 to 70, and you might be able to extend that. And the reason that this is important, not just for Jews, but I think for Christians and other people of other monotheistic faiths, is because this is really the time in which Judaism and eventually Christianity begin to form. People take for granted that the biblical texts were just sort of all there, at one time. But this is a process that comes about. It's a very lengthy process, and the consequence of the first temple being destroyed causes a lot of impact on interpretation of biblical text. Because remember, when the exiles go into Babylon and they're there for decades, and of course many of them stay. This is why there were Jewish communities in Iraq, and even today there are Jews in Iran that have been there for thousands of years. I mean, it's incredible because these people can trace their way back, to antiquity, and so these texts, because the text becomes more important in many ways than the temple, even though of course they want to have the temple to do the sacrifices as part of the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of Moses, but the text becomes more alive, because if you're not in Jerusalem, if you're not in Israel, and you're in the diaspora, if you're in Babylon, what do you hold on to? You hold on, of course, to what we'd say tefillah, to prayer, but you're going to hold on to a text. And the text becomes like alive. It tells you the history, but it also like gives you a way forward. How do you get to the future, right? How do you how can there be redemption? And so the text now becomes very important because people interpret the text. Because before, there was a chain of tradition, and now if you're cut off from that tradition, you have to look essentially to the text and say, well, this is how we're going to re-envision the past. We're going to rebuild the past. And so one of the questions you had, when we were talking was, how did all these different groups, the Pharisees and the Essenes, how did they come about? Well, I would say, and there are many scholars that would say this, that it's really an issue of how they approach the text, because each one of these groups is envisioning the past through a particular lens, and they're also seeing themselves like we're the true representatives of ancient Israel, of pre-exilic Israel. And so they have this idea, this tradition, and they're sort of carrying it forward into later centuries. And they're saying, no, you're not doing things correctly in the temple. It should have been done this way because, we have this tradition, and maybe we have a different calendar, or we have a different approach to this, what we would call halakha. Halakha is the Hebrew word for, it literally means the way to walk, but it would be Jewish law. Like, how do you keep the commandments, the practicalities? And so guess what? These groups have different interpretations on the halakha, on the halachot, in the plural form.
So Dr. Juan, there's a text in the New Testament where Jesus kind of chastises these religious leaders, and he says the traditions of men are making the word of God of no effect. From a Second Temple period, can you kind of speak to what could he have been, talking about?
Yes. So let me start like a traditional Jewish view, and then I'll sort of.
Yes.
So in traditional Judaism today, we believe, that God revealed the Torah to Moses at Sinai and to the people of Israel. I think, Christians, I think, would agree with that. We believe also that the Torah, it's sort of like the Constitution of the Jewish people, like the Constitution of the United States. So today we don't rule by the Constitution, right? I mean, if you pass a law on speeding or your property taxes, all those kind of things, they're not really in the Constitution. What happens is the legislature of each state, or of course nationally the Senate, the representatives, they look at the Constitution and then they say, well, we have the power to derive law, right? We have to do these practical things. And yes, I mean, it makes perfect sense because the Constitution is not into all the details. So there are many elements in the Torah that don't have a lot of precision to them. They don't have the details. And I was giving some person an example this week. There's a verse that where God tells Moses, so the people want to eat meat, they can slaughter it if they're not at the temple or at the tabernacle, the Mishkan, but they should do the way that I have shown them. The way that I have, instructed them. I'm paraphrasing, but you can look it up. And so we have a tradition that goes back thousands of years that says when you have an animal, you have to slaughter it in a certain way because we want all the blood to drain according to the Torah. You have to make sure it's not torn because the Torah says you shouldn't eat something that is torn in the field. There are all these, intricacies that are there. And so the oral law is what provides us like with the details of how to do the commandments, how to keep the Sabbath, how to keep Shabbat, how to keep the kosher laws, all the details. So in the first century, you have these different, they all believe that the Torah should be kept. There's not a disagreement with that.
Mhm.
The issue is the implementation of it. So Jesus, in that sense, is having what we would call a halachic debate with his, his fellow rabbis and Pharisees and Sadducees, because his teachings, this is sometimes a shock to many Jews as well as to Christians. They fit perfectly in that matrix of the Jewish world of the Second Temple, and in that world, you can debate and disagree. And yes, there may be something that is, needs to be corrected. We have those kinds of cases today in the Jewish world, but it's part of this process of, detailing what is important and then the details. And I think that, one thing that you see in the Gospels, my understanding is that, he's sort of concerned with the big picture. But then he makes these comments, and you can correct me, where he says, you tithe of mint and cumin, of spice.
Mm-hmm.
He says, reflect, if I remember correctly, the weightier matters of the Torah. And then he says something amazing, and this is, because I had incredible rabbis and professors. They were Orthodox and conservative and Reformed, but they were very well versed in the New Testament because they saw it as part of the literature. They're part of the literature and the experience of Jews. And he says something amazing. He says you should have done the former without neglecting the latter. So it's not the details that are bothering him. It's really, I think, where the heart is, right? What's the most important, and then you build from that. And so I think that that's the context, is that there's, in the Second Temple, things are still fluid because the temple, the first one has been destroyed. The diaspora has not been resolved. There are Jews all over the place, right? I mean, there's still Jews in Babylon. They haven't come back, maybe because for financial reasons. It's not easy to live in the land of Israel. Even today, in the modern state of Israel, we have people from the United States that go to Israel, and guess what? It's not easy to make it. I mean, Israel today is known as a great technology powerhouse, but there's a lot of, there's a disparate society. Some people do very well. It's like the typical story. Some people do very bad. It's very difficult for immigrants, new language, new culture. So you can imagine the Second Temple, if you're trying to cross, the desert and all these kind of things, people sort of just find themselves where they're at. So in the minds of many Jews, yes, we've come back to the land, but the redemption has not happened.
So Dr. Juan, in Second Temple period, excuse me, sorry, there are some major events that happened that kind of shaped that era. The Maccabean revolt, Alexander's conquest. Can you kind of talk about those things just a little bit?
Yes, and it's important. I'm so glad Maccabees, because this is sort of interesting. It's a parallel conversation. What's amazing is that you have the first book of Maccabees and the second book of Maccabees. Now, oddly enough, these are very Jewish books. I tell people these are like the most Jewish books that you could find. Interestingly enough, we don't have them in our canon. We don't have them in what we call the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, but they are in the Apocrypha. And so they're included in the Catholic Church's canon. They used to be in most Protestant canons, at least what I understand, until like the 1800s. The Eastern Orthodox churches have them. So they have these, it's interesting, they have these very Jewish books, in their canon. And the Maccabees are critical because in many ways, the only reason that we have a first century that we can talk about Jesus or the things that happen is because of the Maccabees. Because the Babylonians come on the scene, and as often happens, another empire comes. As I mentioned, that the Medo-Persians take over, and then they have their time. We have events like the Book of Esther that are very famous under that period of time, and then we have the fall of the Persian Empire with the rise of Alexander the Great. And so when Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire, of course, he doesn't leave heirs. So he divides up this vast amount of territory that stretches into part of India, Egypt, the Middle East, the Levant, into Turkey, Asia Minor, so forth. He divides it among his 4 generals. And these generals, they sort of fight for their own region. And 2 of the generals that are standing are the Ptolemies, based in Egypt, but sometimes they control the land of Israel. And then you have the Seleucids, which control like the northern reaches of like Syria and some of the broader areas to the north. And so what happens is the Seleucids eventually gain control. We call them Syrian Greeks, because they're Hellenized. But whatever the case, they're in charge at that time in the second century BCE. So we're talking about the 100s, but 100 years, 160, basically 200 years before the birth of Jesus, if you want to put it that way for people to reference. And they don't have any issues with Jews per se. I tell people they weren't the classic anti-Semite. What they wanted, though, is they wanted Jews to conform and to assimilate to their Hellenized culture. And so, again, they don't have an issue with Jews being Jews. They just, why can't you look like us? Why can't you eat like us? Why can't you dress like us? Why, hey, go to the gymnasium and do it naked. Why do you? I mean, they want, why, hey, if we put up an idol, hey, I mean, it's just an idol. What's the big deal? So for them, it's enlightening, right? They want to promote this Greek civilization. And the honest truth is that there are some people in Jerusalem that are like, hey, I mean, what's wrong with that? I mean, why does Jewish conflict, with modern or modernity? You can apply that to today,
Right.
And I'm sure you can in Christianity, right, in contemporary culture. And so there's a split in the Jewish community about, well, why can't we have gymnasiums? Why can't we have amphitheaters? And why can't we do these things? But there are certain people that are like, wait a minute, we have a covenant with God. And the reason that we were taken to Babylon, hundreds of years before, is because we weren't faithful to the Torah, to the covenant. So now you're asking us basically to do the same thing, and they don't like that. Of course, they're going to resist. And what happens is the Seleucids are like, well, we're not anti-Jewish, but we're anti-Judaism or anti-Jewish faith. And so the masses rise to the occasion when they see, of course, a Jew, a fellow Jew, participating in a sacrifice, that is unacceptable. And so you have these groups of Kohanim, these priests that become essentially guerrilla fighters. They become insurrectionists, and they take on the Seleucid Empire. And what people don't understand is that it took 25 years. When we talk about Hanukkah, which incidentally is mentioned in the New Testament as the Feast of Dedication, that's only the beginning. That happens very early on in the rebellion because they're able to take the temple. But 25 years past, they're still fighting the Seleucids. And one of the things that the Maccabees do is they forge a relationship with the Romans. So they have like a relationship. They're still fighting the Seleucids. They expand their territory, and eventually they will get to the point where they can have an independent Jewish kingdom, which lasts, depending on how you count, for almost 90 years. Mm-hmm. And it's important for people interested in the New Testament is because Herod the Great arises from the end of that period, and the Roman entry into the land of Israel is caused because of Jewish infighting. Because you have two brothers that should be the priest and king, and it's like, well, wait a minute, which one? Why can't I be the king? And so what they do is they ask the Romans, who they were previously allied with, can you help us resolve this dispute? And so the Romans were, oh, you want us to come into the land of Israel and help you solve this? Of course, So Pompey, the great Pompey of the triumvirate, he says, sure, I'll come in. And of course, he desecrates the temple. And of course, the Romans never leave. But what the Romans do is they'll set up a vassal king. And this is where Herod, of course, comes into play and his sons, because that way the Romans are like, hey, I'm keeping the peace, Pax Romana. You guys have some measure of freedom. You get to keep the temple. You pay us our taxes. And this sets the stage for the first century, because this is where you read the New Testament or other writings, not just the New Testament, the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha. And of course, the Romans are there. You have Jews that are struggling with the Romans. You have Jews struggling with non-Jews, assimilation issues. And then you have these independent holy men and charismatic figures, one of them being Jesus of Nazareth. And this is, from the Roman perspective, this is very problematic because they don't want anything that upsets the peace, and they don't want anything that disturbs taxes, right? And so their approach is that if somebody is saying that this person is the Mashiach, the Messiah, this is a problem because the Messiah implies the king, the kingship of David and the restoration of independent kingdom. So, it's for them, it's not a religious issue; it's a political issue. Then others, you mentioned these differences between the different groups. Not all groups believed in the coming of a Messiah. This is, I think, a mistake that many people make. Not all people believe that there was a resurrection. Not all people believed in necessarily the importance of angels and demons and things of that nature, because you have to look at it. If you look at the Torah, for example, only the first 5 books of Moses, there are many things that are not really spoken about. We read and we derive, Jewishly, Christian wise, we sort of interpret and we draw faith from these certain passages, but certain topics were not really that important, at least on a surface level. I think that's where the oral tradition is very important.
So, Dr. Juan,
Yes,
let
yes.
me interrupt you. You had mentioned the Kohen, the priests that were kind of warriors. I was doing a study and this term Zealots and Sakari come up.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, because from my understanding, the Sakari actually named after their knife that they used. I don't know if that's tradition, or can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. So generally, most people think of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, because I
Right.
mentioned the Essenes aren't, but they're a very important group, because that's where we, at Qumran, assuming that they're the same group, because even some scholars have debated maybe it's an offshoot group of the Essenes. They're very similar to what we find in the New Testament. They talk about topics that are like strikingly similar. They talk about the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. They talk about the new. They talk about the way. I know in the book of Acts, it talks about the early followers of Jesus called themselves the way. There's a lot of similarities. They place a lot of emphasis on tevilah, immersion, ablution, and so forth. They're very important. The Zealots, people are divided exactly on what their religious philosophy was, but they were a group that may have been perhaps aligned with the Pharisees. They had certain beliefs about theology that may have been similar, but I think they took their inspiration from like the Maccabees, in the sense that we have to fight Roman oppression, because Roman oppression, remember, the Romans are polytheists. So from the Roman perspective, they don't have a problem with you believing in one God, as long as, it's in the pantheon, right? They can sort of recognize that. They have a sense that if you're an ancient people, there's a measure of respect that they should give to you. So they have like a measure of respect for Jews in that sense. I think that's why Christians suffered in the beginning stages, because they didn't know what to do with them. Are they Jews? Are they not Jews? Do they believe in God? They deny the pantheon, etc. So the Zealots wanted an independent kingdom. The Sicarii were maybe perhaps like an offshoot of that, and they were often seen sort of as assassins. They play like they're sort of part of this revolutionary trend that is wanting to overthrow the Romans. The Sicarii seem to be a little bit more capable of reacting against Jews that they saw that may have been too closely aligned to the Romans. So groups inevitably formed the basis in the 60s, in the 66. You have to think about something. The temple that Herod started to rebuild was this majestic project, and it actually does not stop until the early 60s of the first century. So they just finished the temple. Just guess what? You have an economic factor. You have thousands of unemployed builders, stonemasons, and all these people that have spent, they had a sort of secure job. And you have Roman procurators, the governors, who are corrupt, and taxes, and just all the things you can think of that would affect the modern society. They have that. And then they also have the Zealots and the Sicarii. And they're sort of saying, well, why not push now? And what happens is they take advantage of the departure of certain Roman officials, and they strike, and they actually have some success in the beginning, and they're able to keep the Romans at bay for several years. But eventually, of course, I mean, the Roman Empire has a tremendous military force, and it takes them quite a while, but eventually they're able to conquer. And as a consequence, yeah, I think scholars debate whether it was the intent of the Romans to destroy the temple, or if it was sort of an act of war, an accident. Because for the Romans, the temple was important because they used this as the point of control and also of taxes, and it was a sign of loyalty. What Jews would do is they had to deal with the emperor. We can't worship you. We can't sacrifice to foreign gods. But what we will do is we'll make a sacrifice to our God, to Hashem, on your behalf in honor of the emperor, and that will be a sign of loyalty. And the Romans are, okay, we'll take that. You guys are sort of weird, you have your, oddities, but we'll accept that for old time's sake. because of Julius Caesar. He had a very favorable view of Jews and so forth. But when Jews decide we're not going to offer that sacrifice, that's a signal, and that's the signal to the Romans that something is up and that a rebellion has started. And so these groups are usually very small, but they're able to sort of drive up a lot of sentiment and emotion, and then it just sort of swells until they find themselves in this war with the greatest power at that time.
Thank you for talking about that. I thought it was very interesting, that there was, like you said, there's these different groups, these independent groups. They pretty much all want the same thing, right? They want the temple, they want their traditions, they want to be able to worship freely, but they're all going about it differently. Can you speak to just a little bit about the writings of that period? Because you mentioned the Essenes, who have been given credit for a lot of the writings, and who else, or what other groups, or what was going on for all that writing? Because there was a plethora of writings. There's like a bunch of writings from that period.
Yes. So the Essenes are known, of course, for Qumran, for this discovery in I think it was 1947. All these scrolls were found. There's a tremendous amount of biblical text, and I think even this year, or last year, I should say, there was like a discovery of another cave and some additional fragments. It's incredible because before that time we had Torah scrolls. I mean, we have some even here in our small synagogue, but the oldest scrolls that we had only went back, I think, maybe to the 9th or 10th century, if I remember correctly. So you're talking about relatively late. And then you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, where you find almost a complete book of Isaiah in the same basic script. And if if you can read this Isaiah today, you could read it back then, and then you find all kinds of a treasure trove of documents that we only knew existed in Greek or in other forms, like Ecclesiasticus. It's part of the Apocrypha, the Wisdom of Sirach. We find fragments of it in Hebrew, all these different texts. It's amazing, and it shows us what the Maccabees, the Essenes didn't write all these things, but for some reason they were keeping these things, maybe as part of their library. But it's clear that they had influence on them, because we see these writings, the ideas that are in these writings about demonology, about angels, about resurrection, about the Messiah or Messiahs, because sometimes the Essenes actually seem to have multiple ones, not just one. Or an ultimate prophet, or something like that nature. Their ideas spread, and they sort of are embedded in different elements of what we know later in Judaism and Christianity. And so I think it goes back to what I said before. In earlier times, writing was something that was more selective. It was more restricted. Only certain scribal classes would be able to do so. And the importance of a book was measured in how many times it was copied. You have these other documents, that's not important, don't worry about that one, do this one. And then by the time of the Second Temple, they actually have Torah scrolls. According to the Talmud, there were Torah scrolls they kept in the temple, complex, and there were slight variations in the script, because they wanted to make sure that they kept like the master copies, if you will, because which one is the ultimate copy, right? Before that time, we have the translation of the Torah into Greek, the Septuagint. Because why? Because many Jews are living outside of the land of Israel, and it's like today, they don't speak Hebrew fluently, they speak Greek. Today we speak English. So the process of translating, you now are imparting importance to that particular book. And then eventually all of the Hebrew will be, let me cancel. Yes, I'm sorry about that. There was we got cut off there temporarily.
It's okay. It's okay. We'll pick it right back up.
And so what happens is, there's after the destruction of the first temple, and I mentioned, people going on to the galut, or the exile, the importance of texts, is elevated, and there's more writing that happens, and these texts become more, central to the lives of the people, because they're not in the vicinity of the temple, and so the reading of scripture becomes more important. and people begin to sort of become more familiarized with it. Because before, you might rely on the priest or the Leviim, the Levites, to sort of teach. But if the center of that existence has been destroyed, you have to develop another class of individuals to transmit that. And what do you have? You have scribes like Ezra. He's a scribe, and he's also a priest. But so you see the change in roles, and as part of this happens, people begin to write more. People begin to reminisce about the destruction of the temple, the exile, the future redemption, and there is a lot of activity that takes place as a consequence of this. And there are traditions that are alive that are being preserved. For example, I'm sure you're familiar with the Book of Enoch, and that's mentioned very briefly in the New Testament. But its ideas are found throughout the New Testament, even if they're not specifically named as attributable to Enoch. You find that at Qumran. You find that in various books like the Book of Jubilees, which the Ethiopic Orthodox Church includes as part of its canon, if I understand correctly. These traditions have spread, and in some quarters, they're actually considered to be sacred texts, like they're sacred, they're scripture. It doesn't happen in all quarters, but these texts begin to become very prominent, and these ideas, begin to reflect the different groups and their views. So, for example, if you're a Sadducee and you say, "Well, we have the Torah, that's what God revealed at Sinai, and ultimately everything else, is secondary." Well, guess what? In the Torah, there's not really an elaboration about a resurrection. You can derive it, from exposition, or you can derive it interpretively, but it's not like a clear statement, right? You die, this happens, clearly. But they would say, well, we don't have any proof that there's a resurrection, so our concern is only on this life. We don't know that the soul is immortal. So you can sort of start thinking, even if you don't agree with them, you can start to see where the emphasis on certain books becomes the way that you interpret. If you didn't believe that Daniel was a part of the canon, then in Daniel you have a very clear message about resurrection, right? It's like the clearest picture. In other texts you have like allusions in the book of Ezekiel, Isaiah, but if you don't include that text as part of your canon, well, that's like another strike. And then when it comes to figures like the Messiah or the Messiahs, that also depends like on an interpretive tradition, like an oral tradition, because you have to sort of extract it. You have to look at the text and sort of look beyond like the plain meaning often, because what does that mean, right? What does redemption mean? What does salvation mean? And so everybody is looking at these texts, and it's not that they're rejecting them. It's that they have their own conviction and approach, and then they go on a different route. And then, of course, in early Christianity, you have a particular claim that is made, and of course, it follows that route. And then you have these divergences that occur as a result.
So you saying that brings up a thought to my mind. The New Testament writers, their interpretation of the Torah, the Psalms, and the prophets, they were bringing interpretations that probably would have conflicted with some of Second Temple, or did it come out of Second Temple thought?
Well, I would say it would come out of it.
Okay.
If you can imagine, like, I have one concern. I don't know how much battery life I have on my phone.
Okay.
So, but if you could imagine, like, I don't know, I'll take my phone here. If this is like the first temple, and then after the destruction of the temple, if you can imagine like different, arrows or something like coming out, it's all based in this ancient tradition. But what happens is these groups are now reading the text in accordance with their views, but they're all drawing from the same source. So even if you have a disagreement on one particular issue, it's not that it's like it's a greater conflict. It's like it's interpretive difference, right? It's the application. And so Christianity in its early form, for lack of a better term, they're drawing from all these ideas. That's why when I mentioned like Enoch, there are so many ideas in the New Testament that are taken for granted. And only by looking at these other texts can you say, oh, that seems to be like the assumption that they're making. Or if we look even later at rabbinic texts, there's a lot of disagreement among scholars to what extent we can use later rabbinic texts to inform the Second Temple period. But I hold the view that you can look at these texts later rabbinic texts from the 2nd and the 3rd century and so forth, because they provide like a general view and understanding of all the different ideas that are in play. And so, there's many ideas in the New Testament that they're not explained. It's sort of like the Torah. There's many ideas that you don't have a lot of detail, but if you understand the greater context and the background, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's why they didn't explain it, because it's assumed that there's a certain knowledge base for that.
So,
And yes, yes.
so just because of, I don't want to lose you.
Yes.
This question's important, and it's kind of a little off topic, but there are groups of people today that dispute Jewish heritage, and they'll say, well, these people aren't the real Jews that are over there in, Jerusalem, and these are who the real. How do you sort through, different groups trying to claim heritage, and may not be, or may be, or how does that even work? I don't know if you've even encountered those types of conflicts.
Well, I think that the first thing you have to do is you have to find what it means to be, Jewish, what it means to be a part of Israel. And I think that there's a lot of emphasis by people on the genetic side, the DNA side. But the difference in traditional Judaism, so I have to give that perspective, is it's not simply a faith, it's not simply an ethnicity. It's really a combination of these things. It's an ethno-religious component. But we have Jews that are Ethiopian, we have Jews that are Moroccan, we have Jews that are Spanish. Our family heritage. We have Jews in Russia, and people say, well, how can that be? That doesn't make any sense, because it's a people, and a people can absorb people from different places, and they become part of that family unit. And so an ethnicity, I think it's very true, like in Hispanic context, and this probably may explain it. I have some friends that are Dominican and some that are Puerto Rican, and they have some ancestry that is African, but they identify as Latinos. Why? Because they speak Spanish, they have Spanish culture, they eat Spanish food. I mean, it's a very different kind of thing. Then we have some people who are fair skinned. They're, I mean, for lack of a better term, they're white. I mean, there's no question about that. But if you ask them, I'm Latino, I speak Spanish, they have a shared history and a sense of a common past. And of course, in that context, it goes back to the peninsula, Spain, Portugal, etc. But I think it's the same way, is that Israel was the founding place of the Jewish people, and they spread throughout the world. And I think that one of the things that a lot of these groups that you mentioned sort of miss is that if you go to Jerusalem, if you go to Israel, it's like the United States. There are people of every color and every creed. Now, when it comes to religious practice, yes, the idea is that we have one Torah, and we don't have there are many different groups within Judaism today. It's usually over practice, the degree of practice. But when they'll all say, yeah, the Torah was given at Sinai. They'll agree to these things, and the main institutions of identity, the Sabbath, these kinds of practices, they'll agree on. And so what we look to, when someone says I'm Jewish, from a legal Jewish standpoint, you want to look for some, quote unquote proof, some document, right? They were affiliated with a synagogue or something, right? A marriage contract, something that they have. And there are ways to remedy that. I mean, conversion is certainly a possibility, and happens quite frequently. But what you're trying to do is be inclusive, but also make sure that there's a sense of loyalty, right? It's like becoming a citizen of another country. A person just doesn't come in and say, well, I'm a citizen. And it's like, oh, well, there's a process for that. And you can still have people from different places that are coming. So I would say that, Jewishness, there is a genetic element there, because when they've done genetic testing of different groups in North Africa, for example, Jews from Morocco, and they take DNA from Jews in Eastern Europe, there are elements of commonality there. And it's like, what a person looks like is not the same thing as DNA or ethnicity. It's simply a reflection of, different biological consequences, right? I mean, that's the outgrowth, or the DNA is one component, and what a person looks like can be completely different.
Right.
So I interact with Jews that people would identify as quote unquote minorities all the time. And yet, they have this shared history and this commonality with other Jews. And you can see that in the synagogue, because what happens is we're reading the same language. We're speaking Hebrew. The synagogue liturgies, I could go, I've gone to Poland. I didn't speak Polish, but I went in and I was, interacting because I was following the Siddur, the prayer book. And I could speak some conversational Hebrew, but that was the commonality. It's like they had a completely different past as far as their experience, but you had a Sephardic Jew from America, and you had a Polish Jew, and Hebrew, and this shared history was what tied us together. And it would be the same thing if you had, I have African American friends that are Jewish. It would be the same thing. It's those texts and the Hebrew and the history and everything that stems out of that is shared. And I think that is probably the answer. More complicated than you may have.
Right. No. It makes a lot of sense. I think you explained that powerfully. I can't wait for people to kind of hear that and kind of work through that. One last thing. What would you say is a good place to start if someone says, well, I want to investigate the Second Temple period, Second Temple literature, where should I start, so that I'm not overwhelmed? Where would be a good place to start?
Well, I hope it's not inappropriate to mention one of my books.
But, no, it's not at all. Not at all.
I have a lot of different books. Some of them are hundreds of pages, and then I started to focus in on very short, easy readers, like 50 pages, very short. And there's one that I called The Transformation of Israelite Religion to Rabbinic Judaism. And the reason I think it's important, whether it's Christians or Jews or anybody else, is because very, very lightly I touch on this process from the destruction to the importance of text and the growth of these sects, these different Judaisms or these different, the Pharisees and so forth. I sort of show that very simply, like I sort of try to avoid a lot of the complexity. I have other books that get into like all the details, but I think it's very short, it's easy, and it just sort of wets your feet. And it says, oh, okay, you know what, I want to learn more about that. And you can say, okay, well, then I want to go in this direction. But that's something that I have a great passion about. You can find it on Amazon. It's actually, interestingly enough, I have some books that are like 600 pages, and I have this 50-page book, and that 50-page book actually sometimes better than the big books, because I think people are looking for simplicity first,
right,
and then they don't want to feel overwhelmed. If they like the topic, then they continue. And I intended it to be like just a very basic intro, and I think that's a good starting place. If not, you can look for plenty of YouTube channels that have history of the Second Temple, and they might term it the times of Jesus or something like that. But those are usually good starting points because they give you like a cultural, historical, and some theological background. And maybe I can send you some links on those for future reference. But
yeah, definitely send me those links, and send me the link to that particular book, that specific book. Definitely would like for people to be able to check that out, and kind of those that are interested in this. I've done some brief teachings on this, and so this was very enlightening. I felt really edified, like, wow, this is really, really good. And you really weren't able to get all the way into much of it. I can tell that there is a deep well of knowledge about these things. And so may have to have you come back and talk about maybe some very specific things and give you some time to really pack in, or maybe have you do a class or something,
thing I wanted to say quickly, we didn't even talk about like the Samaritans.
Right.
That's part of the Second Temple. All the stuff that happens, it's all based in this exciting period of time. And so you can find so many topics in this period of time that you could go on for, hours and hours.
Yeah. And now, after having this conversation, I do have a lot more questions that I would love. And like you said, the Samaritans, I would love to hear about, their journey and when, who they are. And, you mentioned the Feast of Dedications. So I had no idea that was Hanukkah. So
yes.
I would love to get into that deeper. So I've learned a lot here today, and I'm pretty sure the listeners have. And I'm going to, encourage you guys that are listening to send your questions in. I can connect you to Dr. Juan if you want to go deeper. I'll have the link for his book in the description of this podcast, or on the YouTube link also, because I think this was wonderful. And I really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to sit with me, because I'm like a kid in a candy store. I could keep going on for hours asking more and more questions, but I know we can't go on for hours. But first and foremost, thank you so much for coming on. Secondly, is there anything new that you just put out that you would like people to check out?
Yes, I came out with a book. It's called Reimagining Boundaries, and it's the subtitle is Jews and Christians in Late Antiquity.
Mm-hmm.
And what I book, it's on Amazon as well. I sort of raise questions about identity. So this is why I get so excited about it, because it's really all connected. And we think of Jews and Christians as very distinct, nowadays. Of course, we've 20 centuries after the fact. But in the ancient world, the lines were not so easily drawn. And what I sort of propose is that it's like a very nebulous, very flexible existence. And the gray areas were very, it wasn't black and white, is what I'm trying to say. And I talk about how Jews and Christians perceive themselves. And I use some examples like from modern history to show why I think this is important, because both groups often make assumptions about the other. But if you look back at history, there was a lot more interaction. And it had to be, because of the Second Temple. This is like what gave birth, right, to these two different entities as we know them today. So that I'm excited about that. I have a lot of audiobooks that are related to that, but that book, Reimagining Boundaries, I think is it might be a little bit more technical, but I think it raises a lot of good questions. And so I've been excited about that one that just came out a few months ago.
Awesome. Well, again, Dr. Juan, thank you so much for your time. Please, guys, check out his material. Like I said, I'll have the links in the comment section, both for the podcast and for the YouTube, if you're catching this on either one. Wow. Anything that you would like to leave with the folks before we sign off?
Well, I apologize for the interruption. My phone was dying, and I apologize for that. Thank you so much for the privilege. As you can see, I get excited talking about this. I would just say one thing. For me, interfaith dialogue between Jews and Christians is extremely important. This is why one of the reasons I talk so much about the Second Temple, because it relates so easily to the New Testament and Christianity. And I think that communication, like we talked about offline, if you can have dialogue, that's like a tremendous benefit. I think it's something that God is pleased with, and both communities can learn from each other, and they have common goals, like you said. In many cases, it's just we may have different ways of approaching something, but that's something that I truly am grateful to be part of. And just thank you so much for the opportunity, and I hope to be in contact with you in the future.
Yes. Oh, that will definitely happen. And so thank you guys for listening. Again, I'll have the links for Dr. Juan, his books, and how to get a hold of him. Great, wonderful man of God. Really enjoyed this time. And so remember to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. God bless.